afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our March 10th webinar, talking about internal audit considerations in creating an RPA program. My name is Larry Burke, and I'm a principal with Focal Point in the Risk Advisory Group. Today, along with me are our presenters, Renee Herrera, Eduardo Diquez, and Dave Graff. We're going to share with you over the next hour our thoughts about RPA, and more importantly, where internal audit fits in that program. Before we get into the panel, just a couple of announcements. We will try to save at the end of the hour for questions. Feel free to use the question chat window to pose questions, and we will try to address them also throughout the presentation if they're relevant to the topic that we're trying to cover off on. In terms of if we're speaking to a particular slide and you want to have a question, we'll try to answer it in the middle of that. But we will try to save time at the end of the presentation. Secondly, this session qualifies for CPE. In order to do so, it will get 1 hour. We ask you to complete the poll questions. We will track that, and then we will send you your CPE certificates in about a week. Lastly, a recording of today's session will be distributed to everyone who registered. Feel free to share that with your friends and colleagues. So jumping in, I'd like to just let Renee, Eduardo, and Dave introduce themselves, and then we'll talk about the agenda for today.
Sure. Thanks, Larry. My name is Renee Herrera. I'm the IT director for Office Depot. And, thank you for having me. Automation and RPA is one of my favorite topics. So thanks for having me, Larry.
Hi, Larry. Thanks, Renee. My name is Eduardo Diquez. I am the Director for Intelligent Automation at Auxis. I've been specializing in implementations of RPA programs for more than 20 organizations for the past 5 years. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Larry.
Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are right now. My name is Dave Graff. I'm a principal here within Focal Point, having responsibility within the risk consulting and also integrated risk management areas. And so I get to dabble in the RPA world and work with a lot of really intelligent folks in that. And I've learned a lot, and hopefully I'll be able to share some knowledge with everybody on the call today. So thanks for having me. Very happy to be here.
Thanks, gentlemen. So today, just to walk through the agenda, we're really going to focus on internal audit's role, both as a user and a consultant to the business, and lastly, providing assurance to the business, all focused on RPA. There's risks associated with RPA and also governance that should be considered. So why don't we get started? When we think about RPA, or robotic process automation, it is viewed really in the greater context of artificial intelligence. What we're looking at, and this is right from the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence's report that came out last week, when you think about RPA, it is part of a greater artificial intelligence construct. There's a lot of definitions of RPA. We happen to like this definition. And this is really defined as software robotics to help organizations automate tedious and repetitive tasks. And it is a pervasive application. There was a New York Times article that came out on Sunday talking about automation and are the bots coming for your jobs. We'd recommend that just to give you some background if you're not familiar with RPA. But what stood out was that nearly 8 in 10 corporate executives, as surveyed by Deloitte last year, said they had implemented some form of RPA, with another 16% doing so in the next 3 years. So within the next year or so, almost every organization will have some form of RPA. So that really talks to us about audit and what audit's role is around RPA. Dave, can you share with us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Larry. So, the question for all of us here on this session is what role can internal audit play, or what role does internal audit play in in any organization that's thinking about or is already implementing some form of robotics? And there's really 3 main places that internal audit plays. And we're gonna dive into each of these a little deeper as we move through this presentation today. But the first one obviously is internal audit as a user of automation. And so looking within internal audit, and how can internal audit leverage this type of technology to help them perform their audits and to help them support management. The second area, which I consider personally the most important and probably the most valuable role that internal audit can play within the organization, is as a consultant. Internal audit is really uniquely positioned within any organization to not only understand what the entire organization does, but also knows pretty much everybody within all of those critical components, critical parts of every organization, if you will, and has the ability to not only identify where opportunities are for potential automation, but to bring the parties together to help drive the process, just using internal audit's inherent knowledge of the organization. And the third area is internal audit as an assurance provider. And that's a critical role within the organization from a control standpoint to help not only management, but if you're a public organization, help the external auditors understand that as we transform some manual control processes within the organization, and we start to automate them, how do we make sure that not only the right controls are in place, but that those controls are designed and operating effectively as well. So those are really the three main areas. Again, we're going to dive into each one of these a little bit more during this conversation. And we're going to start off by talking about internal audit as a user. But first, we're going to dive into our first polling question here, and that is, what is internal audit's role with RPA within your organization? Select all choices that apply here. We'll give everybody about 30 seconds here to answer that. It's going to be interesting to see what the responses are here, because there are some organizations who are a little bit more mature and a little kind of, further down the road when it comes to implementing RPA. There's organizations who are thinking about it, maybe dabbling, in it a little bit. And then there's organizations who aren't quite sure what to do with it just yet and really haven't started. And honestly, where we are in the world today, it's going to happen to us, right? So we can't wait for this. It's coming at us. So we got to start preparing now. All right. Interesting. It's pretty much evenly spread across the board. That's good to see, right? So internal audit acting in many roles. Although look at that bottom one, right? Almost 40% saying internal audit's not involved, or we just don't have RPA in place yet. And that's very common, right? There's a lot of companies out there trying to figure out how they're going to use this. And that, when we get into the section here where we talk about internal audit as a consultant, that's really where your role becomes helping the organization figure out where it makes sense to use this. But first, let's talk about internal audit as a user here. And so this is a tricky one, because unlike business processes, there isn't all this open opportunity for internal audit to build all these fancy bots to help kind of take over what they do. But there is opportunity for internal audit to use it. And for many years, internal audit has been using RPA. We just haven't called it robotics, right? We've called it fancy, this fancy term, robotic process automation. We've been using data analytic tools like ACL, IDEA, Alteryx, things like that, to help us gather data and analyze data. And using some newer technologies, there's a little more efficient ways to do that as well, using bots to kind of assist you while you're using those data analytical tools, as well as helping us gathering testing information, helping us doing a little analysis, automating some of our testing as well, right? And so there's a lot of different workflow tools out there that help us do that. These are all within the RPA world. And again, it's not us sitting back waiting for this to happen to it. It's coming at us, right? And so we need to really start thinking, as an internal audit function, how do we get in front of this, not only to understand what RPA is, but how do we start to leverage it to make ourselves more efficient? Because as we automate more of our business, processes, from an audit perspective, we're going to have to automate how we interact with them. And so I'd like to ask Renee, because Renee, being at Office Depot, they're doing a lot of cool things there with RPA. And Renee, can you speak a little bit about how internal audit itself may be leveraging, this type of technology?
Yes, definitely. Thanks, David. So I think that, to your point, right, internal audit, as any other business function, we have some specific tasks, repetitive tasks, transactions that, we have found opportunities to use some automation. Because basically, every time you find this type of repetitive task, I mean, that's like a candidate for automation. So in our role, we have, challenged ourselves to find some opportunities. We have seen how the business have taken great advantage of RPA bots and technology. So we challenged ourselves to, start getting into RPA a few years ago. And, to give you an idea of some of the cool things we're doing. So for instance, for, segregation of duties, access segregation of duties, we are using RPA and we have a bot that weekly is running and helping us to look into some of these issues in our ERP system. And that's something that's pretty cool. Now, we probably talk later about the evolution of that, because if you think about, we sometimes develop these automated procedures to audit, but at the same time, those are critical as far as, monitoring your controls. So that's when you start the discussions about, oh, you know what, this would be great for management to use it as a continuous control monitoring. So we have having those discussions, and actually some of these bots that we started developing, that's something that is becoming part of management monitoring controls. But another example, for instance, is in our audits, some of the repetitive tasks around SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, and some of the tests that we do are very repetitive. So we found opportunities, for instance, for access reviews. We do many access reviews annually, and many times a year, we need to test that. So we, work on some automation that basically help us to take all the inputs, and do basically all the testing and write the work paper. So that was a pretty good example also of how we have used RPA.
Great. Thank you, Renee. And it's interesting what you said. And if we can move to the next slide, we're going to get into here. And so where some of the opportunities are, I want to pick on something that you just said there, and then get some thoughts from Eduardo on this as well. You said, hey, we're developing, we've developed some bots in internal audit for internal audit use that actually have turned into part of management's processes, right? And so I know one of the challenges that we have a lot within the organization is selling the value of this type of technology to management, right? Because they don't know what they don't know, but they know what they have. And what they have works for them at some level, right? And the conversations usually turn around, well, what's the investment? What's the ROI? How's this gonna make things more efficient? Is this gonna make my product to my customer better, right? And that's something that I want to talk about a little bit too, is everything that we do in the organization should have a customer mindset to it, right? Even from an internal audit perspective, right? Everything that we do, how do we help our organization serve our customers better? But it's interesting that one of the real valuable ways that I've seen RPA infiltrate the business process areas is through internal audit developing technology to help themselves, and then the business getting a taste of how that works when internal audit comes in and plugs that stuff into their business processes. And then they go, wow, I want this, right? So Eduardo, have, from your perspective, you guys are, you live and breathe this and building this, all this technology processes. From your perspective, from an opportunity standpoint on how audit can not only embed technology for themselves, but help the business understand the value. What have you seen out there, and and how that works?
So one of the biggest things as internal audit teams are trying to build automations. Naturally, the first step that every organization takes is try to revert to, how do I build an ROI based on hardcore savings? And this comes down to hours invested in specific processes. How often are this done? A lot of the processes that are done by internal audit are not necessarily done on a daily basis, every single day. They're done on a periodic basis, a couple of times a year. So how to build a business case around internal audit cases really drives down to comparing it to risk. My current process is how much am I being exposed to not getting the job right, or having errors while I do it, or how often do I do it, or what is my level of confidence that I am being able to achieve what I want to achieve in the timely manner that I expect. So there's a lot of things being built these days on, what's the cost of doing this the way that I do it today. If I would like to do it more often, how much would it actually cost me? So you can compare the actual solution to what you're trying to build with RPA. I think a great example that Renee just mentioned is around, access controls. How do I know entitlement reviews? How do I know who has access to what? In a lot of cases, that is very manual. It takes a lot of time when everything is not even centralized. Now that we have hundreds of SaaS applications that not necessarily connect to your, master data that you can know who has access to what. So I think RPA plays a great role there because it enables you to do things that you're not doing today. So there is a point of view around automation in the internal audit space that goes there that I think is very valuable.
It's great. Thank you, Eduardo. It's interesting. And, and for me, the more I look at this slide, the more it becomes important to me over the governance processes. And we're going to get into the governance process as well, because I think about, depending on the industry that you're in, and you're embedding automation to maybe take over some repetitive tasks or make some part of your process more efficient, there's the regulatory aspect, right? And how do we make sure that we're not replacing, we're not transforming or automating something that can create some regulatory or some compliance issue for us as well, right? So it's all of these considerations. How do we make sure that we, that we're complying with that? And that's what makes it an interesting prospect for me in developing this automation for use by internal audit and taking it out to the business, and then the business seeing it and wanting to buy it, right? Quote unquote, hey, I want that. But then because it's not just for internal audit, now when you're embedding it in the business process, there's all these new risks that might show up, right? And all these things that we have to start thinking about now. And so that's a good segue into our next topic in here. And again, for me personally, other people may have a different opinion of this, but I think this is probably the most valuable role for internal audit to play within an organization. And that's as a consulting partner, right? And so again, as I mentioned earlier, internal audit's uniquely positioned. It's one of the few organizations within any company that has a complete end-to-end look at what the organization does, especially in organizations that sell different products, a conglomerate, if you will, right? They have companies that are completely unrelated to each other. The internal audit function is usually one of the only places in the organization that has a complete understanding of what the organization does end to end. They also have the contacts because of that, because you're constantly talking to people throughout the organization. But the most important thing is internal audit understands the business processes, because we dive deep into them and we have to understand them all the way down to the most tactical level. And we're in a unique position to help management identify opportunities for where efficiencies can be built into the process using this type of technology. And so, I feel there's been a movement within the internal audit industry to, the Institute of Internal Auditors calls it becoming a trusted advisor. And while we can't let go of our core discipline, which is being that independent arm, for management to make sure things are working correctly, how do we maintain our value in the organization, right? Well, the one way we maintain it is by helping management make their processes and make what they serve to the customer better. And so, as we think about this topic, I'd be interested, Renee, from where you sit, within Office Depot there, from a value play perspective, how does management see the value of internal audit when it comes to, from a consultation standpoint, especially when you're helping them try to identify where they can automate things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, Dave. So one of the things that I will fully agree with you is you were talking about, the three different areas that, audit gets involved on RPA. And this one probably is the one that adds the most value. So I fully agree with you. And based on my experience, I would say that I see this, basically I can summarize it in three areas. The first one is, as a, I would say pre-implementation partner. I think that's an area where we can add huge value. So for instance, at Office Depot, we were lucky to have some visionaries in the finance operations area. So several years ago, they started playing with RPA. But then when they started to getting serious about building a center of excellence, we start talking to them, and they brought audit on board, and they said, hey guys, we're planning to create this center of excellence. We know that these bots are going to ramp up, and we definitely want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So we did a pre-implementation review where actually we were able to provide some advisory, not only around the specific IT controls, but also, for instance, we had a lot of discussions about governance. Like for instance, they wanted to have some specific objectives, strategic objectives to make sure that this center of excellence will serve the company well, and that, for instance, this was a center of excellence that will help to create bots for all the organization across different business units. And that's an area, like for instance, when we were doing our advisory, we gave them some good recommendations for them to accomplish that goal. Also, for instance, with the funding model, they were struggling as far as like, well, this is being funded this way. So when we kind of look at the governance, how, the parties and the stakeholders, I think that Audit, can be a great partner, it can provide some good advice as far as, governance models and how they want to move forward with the program. The second aspect I would say that we add a lot of value is specifically, with some of the key controls that they want to implement. So for instance, on the IT side, we look at the design of IT controls, and that was actually very beneficial to that organization because, when they start ramping up bots in the finance organization, we start having discussion, and we pointed out that some of the processes where they were building bots, those were SOX related processes. And that's something that they got really interested because they said, oh yes, we want to benefit from RPA in some of those processes, but I guess that will that will change the SOX controls and how we execute some SOX controls. So that's something that definitely we want to make sure that we have the right controls from the IT perspective, as well as from the business process controls perspective. So we gave them some good advice in regards to having the right ITGCs, having the right controls in place, because also we needed to involve the external auditors because eventually they were going to be auditing, that infrastructure as well. And I guess the third aspect, I would say more like an ongoing advisory. As they have been growing and bringing some more bots and growing the organization, we've been like a sounded board from them. So annually, at least annually, we have discussions about how the program is going, and also, for consideration. So for instance, they decided to grow that much that they say, okay, and also we want to save costs, we want to move to the cloud. So they just move all the infrastructure to the cloud, the Blue Prism infrastructure, which is what we use at Office Depot. And that's something that we can like work with them to make sure that, mapping of control, design of controls in the cloud, that everything was properly done.
If I may add something, Dave, to that.
Sure.
I think the best role that internal audit can play around RPA, I think it's, continuing with Renee's train of thought, is really building that governance around the program as a whole. It's not just, the guidelines, the process of how the information is gathered, how are they approved, what are the things that need to be taken into consideration as you look at automations. A lot of organizations begin automation just building the bot and only thinking about, hey, this is going to take me 8 weeks to develop this process, but not really taking into consideration that 5 years from now, you're looking at an automation that now the business depends on, and taking into consideration the business continuity component of the process. What happens if the bot breaks? What happens if now that you potentially have redeployed 10 FTEs to do something else, and now you don't have those people there to come back and rescue you if the bot doesn't work. So I think that role of making sure that the automations are not only creating the benefit for the organization, but making sure that you have the right organizational or the right operating model to ensure that the business doesn't hurt from an event is a critical point of view that I think internal audit is uniquely positioned. A lot of the finance and operations people are not really thinking about that. They're just going in and saying, hey, I can get a lot of savings from doing this. But you also want to say, okay, that's great. And I really don't want to get in the way, but you want to make sure that you understand that this could happen and we need to do something about it.
Absolutely. And we're gonna dive into that topic a little bit just in a few minutes here as well. So I'm really glad you brought that up because out of our consultation role and leading into our assurance role, that's kind of the bright line that we cross in making sure that the organization has strong governance processes, right? So we're going to talk about that. And that leads us into, hey, where are some good opportunities in your organization? And so we'll ask Larry and Eduardo to speak to that as well. Larry.
Thanks, Dave. And we probably get this question once a month from a client saying, hey, what should I automate? And what we typically respond back with a question is saying, well, what is the company's digitalization strategy? And what we want to make sure is that RPA is really part of a greater migration as companies look to improve analysis and decision making and reduce what we call the compilation process. If you go back and look at some studies, about 80% of a finance using finance, about 80% of their efforts are spent on compiling the data and 20% are spent on analyzing the data. That construct has been consistent for decades. And so RPA is a game changer in that, because it will take some of those manual processes and reduce the compilation time. But Eduardo touched on some important risks that organizations need to think about when they start that transformation, that digital transformation process. You know, about business continuity, about siloing. And we also talked about, you know, companies talking about, well, I've got RPA and I've got ML and I've got AI, and it's the alphabet soup of digitalization. Let's talk a little bit about that in the greater construct of where is RPA being implemented? What are you seeing with the implementations? And what are some of the criteria that you use to help the organization decide where to implement from a risk control and from an audit perspective?
Perfect, Larry. I think one of the biggest things is what is truly intelligent automation? And it's kind of the combination of all these technologies, right? Where do you play with machine learning? Where do you use AI? Where does RPA fit in everything? In our world, intelligent automation will be basically forced or triggered by a platform in the center, which we believe is RPA. RPA will be managing all the tasks and processes, moving the data around in order to be able to achieve full automation of activities, and will trigger different third-party platforms to do different things, such as natural language processing and things like, you know, AWS and Microsoft Cognitive, machine learning platforms. Now, there's a lot of different I guess directions that every single platform is going. Like Blue Prism is going in one direction, UiPath is going in one direction, UiPath truly wanting to position themselves in the middle of all of this automation. So really what's happening, machine learning is pretty today, on a practical sense, is being used on the extraction and management of unstructured data. That is their main activity that they're playing today in the intelligent automation space. There's a lot of complex machine learning models that are being used on predictive analytics and marketing, but that's for a lot of higher end organizations that have literally dozens of people just doing this. But RPA is being implemented across the board on doing this, like you said, Larry, very accurately, mundane, repetitive tasks that can drive benefits and savings on things that truly people don't even want to do today anymore. You're having a really hard time keeping those people actually employed. They're coming in, getting trained, leaving after 6 months, and it truly becomes I believe that in the next 5 years, it's going to be very difficult to keep employees in those positions. So RPA is going to play a great role of maintaining productivity and capacity across the organization. I'm hoping that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And the CEO of Blue Prism was quoted as saying, we think any business process can be automated. And so really there is no sacred cow that can't be automated as the tools get better and better. That leads us to our next poll question. And so we'll let folks talk about what we're seeing or what they're seeing in their organization around RPA. We'll give it a minute. Okay, let's see if we get the results. So mostly finance, but you know, operations and internal audit are you know, neck and neck for number 2, with IT slightly behind. So I think that's pretty consistent with what you're seeing across Eduardo, with what you're seeing and with what we're seeing across our client base. And as you move into RPA, Renee touched on it briefly, but as a critical component, and we've all talked about the governance model. And when we think about governance, what we wanted to just present to the group here today is that internal audit's role is kind of twofold. It helps management reduce information asymmetry, meaning management doesn't always know everything that's going on in the business, senior management. And so internal audit can help provide that information back to management to help them make better decisions. But it is also responsible for providing the board, those charged with governance, feedback on RPA programs. And over the past, let's call it 5 years, we've seen more and more focus on digitalization and how audit is being asked to monitor and provide oversight in that process or provide advisory services to that process. Renee and Eduardo, you both touched on governance as kind of a foundational item for successful programs. So would you like to chime in a little bit about if you're interacting with the board, or is it just at the top management teams, and how that governance kind of trickles down into the business for successful RPA outcomes, as well as some learnings where things didn't go as planned, and what were some of those governance failures?
Sure.
You want to start, and I'll jump in later.
Sure, no problem. So thanks, Larry. So I would say both, Larry. Primarily, we work with management and senior leadership. Like, for instance, when we had RPA started at Office Depot, it was more like a finance type of initiative. But then when the business realized that this was growing and we want to really have a center of excellence for the company, the CIO was completely, vetted into this initiative. And that's where, audit also came to have some discussions and with them, because they had concerns about the overall governance model for RPA, how we were going to get the most resources, the most benefits from the limited resources that we had. And I think Eduardo talked about that as well, because one of the challenges sometimes in organization is building that pipeline of RPA projects. That's an area where sometimes management needs some guidance and help, because when you say, well, RPA is about, you want to automate tasks. So you can fill this pipeline of a lot of opportunities, hundreds and hundreds, but how many of those are the real whales you want to go after? So that's an area where, we had some good discussions. And then for the board, definitely, as they understand that management is putting more efforts on RPA, I mean, they were glad to see that as part of our audit plan. And this was back 3 years ago when we did the RPA review. They were glad to see that, audit is also providing some oversight in terms of controls and governance.
To add a little bit to that, so usually in our clients, we have a steering committee in place that is a multifunctional steering committee that brings from operations to finance to IT. This technology is unique in the sense that, it's code you're developing, but you're truly developing on top of other applications. So you need to have and make sure that you have all the stakeholders in place as new applications are being changed, that you are aware that everything is tested accordingly to make sure that things are continuing to work in the long run. At the highest level, naturally, you need to have a governance model that enables you to really, like Renee was talking about, understand the funnel, opportunities, what is getting approved, what are the guidelines for any process to get in the pipeline, and how are those being deployed on timelines and what is expected. But truly adding to, I think where the governance really plays a great role is on the actual, once a process has been selected, what is going to be the procedures to get those processes implemented around access control, how the deployment is completed, how the testing is completed, who is going to be doing the code review, and how we're going to be analyzing those approvals to ensure that there is no risks on the deployments as they're being done. And the end, which is to me the most important thing, which is often overlooked, is how is the support model going to be in place, how we're going to be managing issues, and how we're going to be making sure that automations are up and running after they've been deployed. The
sustainability piece, and so we're looking at the slide in front of you is the new IIA 3 lines of defense model. For those of you that this is relatively new, for those of you that haven't seen it, the big change from the older model is that internal audit now is definitively working with the business. And so we've talked a lot today about consulting or advisory, but internal audit also provides assurance services and will actually go in and perform audits of the bot implementation, the RPA implementation programs. And so Renee, you've had the unique opportunity, I think, to play both roles in that. And how do you balance, on the one hand, being an advisor to the program early on, to also providing assurance and doing a truly independent audit of aspects of the RPA program? What are some of the challenges and some of the pitfalls as you go through that process?
Yeah, so I guess on the advisory side, I guess the key thing is to make sure that, audit is not in the business of, deciding on implementing controls. We provide advice as far as like what management's intent is, as far as what controls they want to put in place. And we can like provide this, perspective as far as like, okay, is this exactly what you need to address the risk? Or maybe you are partially mitigating the risk and there is certain aspects of risk that you're not thinking about. So in our advisory role, that's one of the key things we do. We can like go through that risk assessment and we help management to say, okay, yep, this is what you plan to put in place. Looks, I think, in paper looks good, but are you really addressing all the risk? I guess when it comes down to making sure that on the compliance, wearing our compliance hat, we make sure that, when we go back and do the testing, I mean, we're completely, independent from management and we do our independent testing. Now for RPA specifically, is interesting because at Office Depot, we have a finance organization. They have implemented some bots that they took over some SOX related processes and controls. So it's been very interesting because now as part of our annual SOX testing, we audit the RPA platform. We audit that for ITGCs, but at the same time, there is some business processes, SOX business processes that are basically performed by bots. And we test those as automated controls. So those are SOX automated controls, and that's something that we do completely independent.
And I would imagine the external auditors also look at that as part of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Absolutely, Larry. That's a great point because, the first year, actually, when we saw that coming, we started having some discussions with external auditors about it. So they were kind of in the loop. And then by the time when management put in place those bots that were handling some SOX related processes and controls, they kind of like knew what it was coming. And definitely we coordinated with them because they also audit those platforms and those controls, Larry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a key. That's a key piece of auditing an effective RPA governance program. And what we have in front of us here is the governance model, and internal audit is part of, from a audit perspective or assurance perspective, going to go and audit any one of these 4 areas or sub areas under the governance model if we were developing our audit program. And Renee, I think you hit on the risk piece of it. And like any good auditor, we always start with, well, what is the risk to the organization when we do our annual plan from an audit perspective? And what are the processes, controls in place? And so what I'd like to do is have some Dave and Renee and Eduardo just in general talk about some of the risks that you're seeing around RPA. Some of the obvious ones we've talked about, but maybe some of the ones that may be more like a black swan type risk. Eduardo, you may have a couple of stories about something like that where folks used to be with an organization or no longer with the organization and nobody knows how to do anything because the bots took over.
Yeah, so I think this things, Larry. So this goes in the same line that I was talking about, the long-term, the long-term view of automation. One of the biggest risks, and I know everybody knows about the story of this very complex macro that was doing, marvelous things, and then the person left and it no longer works, and the organization really depends on it working again, and it really creates a lot of pain. Well, imagine that by 100. So not doing this right from the get-go can really create a lot of pain in the future of understanding what does it take to actually have the right level of documentation, the right level of support, the right processes in the back end to make sure that these automations enable the organization for the long run. To me, is the critical piece to success. It maintains, not only security for the business, but also it creates a lot of, employee satisfaction. And if it breaks, it will create a lot of employee dissatisfaction and will put the whole program at jeopardy. So I think it's important to do that. If we're talking about the black swan, and this is something that I think a lot of people overlook. But when you're building bots, you're providing access to systems to a developer to do a specific project, and there is the possibility of somebody maliciously putting code in it that is really hidden within the RPA development that could be triggered after the bot is in production. So having the process of having code reviews, making sure that another developer is taking a look at the code, making sure that the code is doing what is expected is one of the key things that we as a company strive to as we're moving into production of anything. So having that change management, deployment management in place that not only takes care of where are credentials hosted, are they encrypted, are they is the code up to specs, is it doing what was supposed to be doing, and have all the scenarios that were supposed to be tested have been tested and approved before you go to the deployment is a critical piece under that. So our black swan has never happened to us, but it could theoretically happen, and it's something that it's got to be in place. So we have prepared against it.
Yeah, and I think as you talk about that, and IA as an assurance partner, IA can place a role across all areas of the RPA. But one thing that we've seen is that sometimes IA may not have all those resources internally, and they will often partner with a co-source partner to bring in, as you talked about, Renee, we've seen secure code reviews done independently by audit, even though it's done by IT, typically to provide that additional level of assurance. Auditing the SDLC process, and I think most importantly, auditing organizational change is critical. Renee, as you look at this, the implementation lifecycle, do you have any thoughts about one particular area or areas that just stand out to you from a risk perspective, and where, if you were to think about your audits coming up, what area you'd like to see investigated a little more thoroughly?
Yes, yes. So one of the key areas, and I know Eduardo mentioned about this on the SDLC change management, I think that's very critical. Also on the change management process as an ongoing, basis. So things that we have seen good areas of risk is that, for instance, in these environments, when you have RPA and bots running, there could be a lot of changes, not necessarily to the RPA infrastructure, but sometimes they're reading the screens, they're doing this, they're grabbing information from other systems, they're grabbing and doing some screen, grabbing a screen from a bank, external sources. So something that we have seen a lot of risk is the change management process. It has to be very thorough, because as you implement RPA, you go to Wells Fargo Bank because you're doing a reconciliation for Treasury, you grab something the night before Wells Fargo changed the website and changed how things look into the website. Boom, the bots fail next day. Yeah. So those are things that it's an operational model, and that's something we have worked with the RPA team, and in our audit we talked about it, because there is a lot of risk on that area. Same thing with the model or the processes to support failures, because you will have a centralized RPA team, but they don't have all the business knowledge. So I think Eduardo talked about that, right? You will have, like, let's say you implementing a bot for accounts payable, but the other one is for treasury, and then you have an IT support team, but then you need to have some good, support procedures to make sure that if a bot fails, you have like a key point of contact from those business areas, subject matter experts who will understand RPA, and they can jump really quick into kind of like address any issues. So those are the things that we have kind of like had some discussions with management.
Yeah, Eduardo, you had mentioned the bot monitoring the bots.
Yes,
as a control mechanism.
So there is I wouldn't say that it's a specific process, robotics process, that is monitoring the bots, but naturally platforms that do this, and I'm talking real, RPA platforms, maybe not desktop automation solutions, but real automation platforms that now understand that once you scale, robotics scale, is really hard to know how the environment is changing, if there's any changes that are happening, to make sure that those are communicated immediately. So what Renee mentioned is something that happens often in healthcare and banking and in many different, once you're working with third-party platforms that are not controlled by you, and that you cannot control the change of the actual code that is happening, you're really at their mercy of changing every week for you to need to have a right process to make that happen. So solutions like UiPath having implemented or all of their bots are being controlled by Orchestrator, which is almost like the brain of all of automation, that is making sure that all the processes are running when they're supposed to be running, that the volumes, if they change, you know about them, that it enables you to actually create alerts when something in the environment changed, and it not only tells you that it changed, but it tells you what changed, and it sends you the necessary information to be able to attack it and fix it. Sometimes the fix can take you as long as 2 hours, or it can take you 2 weeks. So it's really important for you to understand as the assurance player, when you're looking at these processes and how much benefit they're going to be making, what is the pain of this automation being down for 2 weeks? That's a key question that I always ask. If something breaks and this can be working for 2 weeks, what type of implications will you be? So when you're talking about bots, reviewing bots, it's almost like a mother, automation, or like the parent of the little bots. That is, you need to have that in place in order to do this at scale. Having them just running around separately without no controls is very difficult to be successful at this.
Yeah, and Dave, we were talking about when we think through the control lens, prevent controls and detect controls. Provide us some input and feedback about kind of the capabilities we're looking for in a preventative control set versus the detective control set.
Yeah. And so this is the age-old battle for internal audit, right? And that's what's the best control to put into place in a business process without inhibiting the business process. And so I think that's the first question we need to ask is, okay, I see a risk within a business process. I'm introducing potentially new risks that we've never seen before by automating. But so if the intention is to automate to make something more efficient and more accurate, how do I make sure I don't over control it and take away the benefit, right? And so if I think the best place that we always want to go from control, from a control standpoint, is to input preventative controls, right? That's where really we want to be. And so questions we need to ask ourselves around preventative controls, obviously, what are we looking to control, but also is it going to interfere with the efficiencies gained from the automation, right? And so to what Eduardo and Renee were talking about, now that I have bots, how do I monitor the bots? How do I make sure that they're staying in control, right? Layering that automation or that control activity on top of the bot, if I'm trying to prevent it from doing something, that may take a little more effort than trying to detect, right? Because I may be getting in the way of what the bot needs to do or what my business process need to do by trying to prevent something, right? So what I've seen a lot within the automated control environment is more of a detective control, and it's really the speed to detection, right? So it almost becomes preventative in the sense that I detect something going wrong so fast that I can take action immediately. And whether that action is pulling the plug on the bot until I fix it, or taking some other action to fix the data inputs into the process, whatever's causing the error. Because sometimes the bot we may be getting an error coming out of the process, and it's happening so fast because the bot is processing, but it's not the bot that went wrong, it's the data inputs or whatever information's coming in, right? So it really comes down to, okay, I don't want to inhibit, so maybe preventative is not the way. I want to go detective, but how fast can I detect it? Because again, that's a little more critical now than it ever has been in the past, because of how fast bots can process things.
That's right. That's a good segue into our next question about internal audit and where we stand on the RPA landscape. So let's give that a minute.
This is an interesting question too, Larry, because again, for a lot of organizations, this is new. So for internal audit, it's still fairly new, right? And so how well do we know RPA in general? We probably know our business processes pretty well, but how well do we understand RPA? So how good are we at really providing these services just yet?
Yeah,
Right.
and I think that we'll wait for a minute and then we'll jump into our panel discussion. I know we have a question in the chat that we'll also try to address. But let's see what these results look like. Okay. So I think the most popular answer is questioning internal audit, still trying to determine how it fits into the RPA process. And as we think about our panel discussion now, one of the things that I think a lot of internal audit departments struggle with is, number one, as we see, where do we fit? But there's also a skill set component. And so I'd open it up to Renee and say, Renee, when RPA was first rolled out, how did you train your teams about learning about RPA and then how to understand from a risk and audit control perspective what would be the next evolution once they have an understanding of what an RPA does?
Yeah, that's a great question, Larry. So as many other topics in audit, sometimes, we have to learn and we have to be fast learners, but also we have to make sure that we're smart as far as how we use resources, right? So I know in our case, we use internal resources. So for instance, we partner with the RPA Center of Excellence, who actually they were, giving like some training, even, Blue Prism, they had like some free training available to the company. So some of our resources kind of like, they were learning about it. So they took some of that, but also we kind of like rely on some of our, external partners, our consultants and partners. They always have subject matter experts. And I remember at the time, we had some discussions with them so we can really kind of like, because they have gone through so many other customers and they have experience. So we went through those discussions. So that kind of help us to really start building our knowledge and understanding. And the other piece is with the training, because, our team actually got a little bit hands-on on how this, Blue Prism and RPN worked. So that's something that really helped us for us to learn really quick and get up to speed as far as, RPS technology and how that works.
Thanks, Renee. Dave, did you want to pipe in on that from what you've also seen? From an audit perspective?
Yeah, if I could, I think maybe it's somewhat related from a control standpoint, but I did just see a question or a comment from somebody that came in, which is very interesting. And it's around citizen developers. And it's all related to the control thing that I'm about to bring up here, which kind of expands on what, Renee's talking about. But the comment is, hey, does the whole citizen developer movement cut through some of the recommendations that we've talked about in this presentation? And so from one standpoint, I'd say, yeah, it might. But from another standpoint, I would challenge to say, in the citizen developer model, who is the person or the people that are making sure processes are followed and the controls are in place in the business process that you're actually developing for, right? Because the citizen development model sometimes is about speed to production as well, too, right? And so, yes, the technology is built, the technology works, and we're getting it in cheap and quickly, but it might not address the control environment, which is really what we're trying to focus on here, as well as internal audit, not only as a user, but as a consultant and as an assurance provider to the organization. So even if it's not internal audit, make sure in that model, there's somebody watching out for the governance and the control model, because things can go bad in that model quickly because of the speed to market of it.
Yeah, Dave, I would like to add something to that, because I responded to that question. And I would agree that initially, intuitively, citizen developer, it takes away control from anybody. Now, if it's done right and implemented through the right platform, you don't have to lose control. If the citizen developer program is pretty much like, applications sitting on everybody's desktop for them to do automations that are blind to the COE, I would agree with you, because naturally it's exactly what's going to happen. For solutions like UiPath, the citizen developer program, it depends on who is going to be consuming those automations. Like if you're in the finance department and you have a citizen developer doing something for AP, they built something that they want all AP clerks to be using. You want to make sure that automation is published for the COE. The COE curates that automation, and that automation is deployed for everybody to consume. So the COE is pretty much making sure that the code is up to specs. They know what's the latest version. They implement it the right way. And even for automations that are done for self-consumption, you want to make sure that at a minimum, those automations are being reflected as existent within the organization and who is consuming them. You don't want to get in the way of people building their own automations, but you want to make sure that those automations, or that the organization has visibility to who is using what and for what. And just by having the right platform in place with the right procedures for people to consume automations, you can achieve this in the citizen developer program. You can. You just want to make sure that you build it the right way.
And I think when you think of anybody who has developer access or doing development, the most common risk I think I've heard is, well, do developers have access to production? And do I have a system access issue? Do I have an elevated access issue? Do I have downstream segregation of duty issues? And we're seeing more and more focus on that, at least in the Sarbanes-Oxley world.
Yeah.
And so I just like to open it up to our panel and get some comments on that. And this may be our last general question, because we're coming up on 1 o'clock.
Yeah,
So,
you know, Larry, you've touched on that. That actually touches on another question that came in around, hey, you know, we're trying to attempt to implement some RPA stuff, but we really don't have an IT QA test environment. So we're going right to production. And what are some of the risks that we face challenges around sensitive information or protected information? And so, you know, the question here is, how are companies getting around this kind of challenge where there's a risk of a developer accessing sensitive customer information in a live production system? So Eduardo and Renee, I know you guys have seen this. Why don't you guys chime in on that one?
So this really drives to the third-party platforms, right? If you're like we were just talking about banking statements, you go to Wells Fargo, you want to do a cash reconciliation. There is no test environment. You got to be willing to understand that there's no such thing as a test environment in some cases. This happens a lot in healthcare once you're working with payers. You know, United Healthcare is not just going to give you a test environment of their platform to just do the development that you're looking for. So how do you build this? And there's going to be two versions of this. Ones are pure extraction of data. There is no transactions happening. There's no changes to the information that is happening. It's just extraction of data. That's how I classify them. And then there is the actual submission of information that can be sensitive in these portals, such as a patient information, into submission of a case for approval with healthcare. Let's take that as an example, which you have no way to develop. So what we've done is two things. One, for the first one, we have done a very controlled access environment where the developers are basically being able to extract that specific information with specific oversight and milestones from subject matter experts. We want to make sure that the code is being done, you know, step by step. You're almost having a bi-daily review of where we are, where we stand, and you're having a demo of what the body's doing every other day. And when we're talking about the actual submission of information, there is no way to go around this, but to actually have what we do is to have subject matter experts on time oversight of the development. They need to see what the developer is doing. They need to see what the bot is doing in order for you to achieve that. There is no easy answer to this one. I don't know, Renee, what you have done, but there is no easy answer but to say that you have to have a structured oversight, a plan to make sure that your user accesses to those applications are tight, and you have a plan, a specific time where those access are being provided to that developer, so that can get done. But there is no way to do this without, actually.
We got about 30 seconds, Renee.
Yeah, no, actually, I will just summarize what Eduardo said, because I think he nailed it. Basically what we're saying is that in some of those kind of like development environments, or where you're doing development, or you would say pseudo production, you just need to have a stringent controls. And that's kind of like what we have seen, right? Because usually in development environment, you don't test, or, you have more flexibility. But in these cases, I mean, when that happens and you're extracting production data from other platforms, it's still just for your development, you just need to make sure that your controls are very tight in those environments.
Yeah, and I think I think what we're saying, and I know we're going to wrap it up in about a minute now, but the DevSecOps is what is the speed to development and get code out and features out is a good topic for an upcoming webinar. So keep your eyes posted with Focal Point. Just to recap, I want to extend a hearty thank you to our panelists, Eduardo and Renee. And for those listening in, if you are interested in the slides, we are happy to provide them. Just send an email to us, info@focal-point.com. For those that are signed up for the CPE and look for having answered all the questions, we'll get you CPA certificates out by the end of the week or early next week. And then lastly, if you had some colleagues or friends that have interest in this topic, this recording will be posted and will be available for all that are interested in observing. So that's about it. We've wrapped it up. We've hit 1 o'clock. Actually, we're 1 minute past. So we appreciate you joining midweek in the middle of March, and wish everyone a great rest of the week and a great rest of the month. Stay safe and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.